In the previous AMS videos, I've been through each of the available AMS settings, and I've already shown how to build a really dynamic organ patch using alternate modulation sources that give hands-on and feet-on control over your sound. Now I'm going to conclude by using AMS to produce a really versatile guitar sound that allows you to add feedback and Van Halen style dive bomb pitch bends and a wah-wah. Also, if you're using an external controller like the Alesis Vortex, you can have even more controls, such as aftertouch to bring in some radical filtering and the LFO effects that a guitarist can only dream about. The approach I'm going to suggest works really well on lead synth patches as well as guitars. So for anyone looking for those Jordan Rudess Dream Theater style sounds where he impersonates solo guitars on the verge of feeding back, but with a synth, I'll show you how that can be done. And I'll give you some AMS settings that you can apply to any presets that will give you hands-on and feet-on control for really dynamic performances every time. Now you might think you need to use a combi for really expressive guitars, but when you've heard this sound, you'll realise that you don't even need to go too far beyond one of the program presets. Just using AMS and the AMS mixer to add some seriously expressive effects will give you really usable sounds. Combis, where more than one of the different programs that have been joined together might want to use a controller for different effects, they can actually limit the control that you have, so there's a good reason for using a single program. We'll look at the use of combis with AMS at the end of this, but let's go back to single programs. I'm going to start with the Screaming 2 guitar preset, number 18 in the guitar category, basically because half of the work's already done for you. I'm going to dissect this particular sound so that you can see how it's built up to provide the feedback effect and the muting effect. This will allow us to use this on other solo patches, both synth and guitar. Now if you start by playing a note and push the mod wheel, you'll notice that you get both vibrato and a feedback tone with this preset. I've started by pressing the menu button and selected the P basic page. This sound uses two oscillators. Using the arrow on the dial, tab over to and select the single setting to change the sound to a single oscillator. Press a key and you'll note that the vibrato is still present when you push the mod wheel, but the feedback effect has gone. So clearly it doesn't take Sherlock Holmes to deduce that the feedback effect is coming from the second oscillator. Now leave the second oscillator off for the time being, press the menu button and select the P pitch page. If you select the mod tab, you'll see that LFO1 mod wheel intensity setting is 0.4. Now this is enough to give a nice guitar style subtle vibrato. To get an idea of what this control is doing, wind it up to about 1.2. And you can see you get a much wider bend. Okay, shift that back to 0.4 and press the menu button. Go to the P-OSC LFO page and you'll see in the WAV page that the waveform in the LFO in the preset is the guitar waveform. Now I changed the waveform to a square wave so you can see the difference that the waveform is having on the vibrato. Now change that back to the guitar, and in the frequency page the present setting is 64. Let's stop messing with that. So at 64 you can see a fairly natural vibrato is occurring, the type of vibrato that a guitarist would use. Now press the menu button and go back to the P pitch page. In the mod tab, the eagle-eyed will have noticed that the LFO1 has an AMS setting of AMS Mixer 2 and the amount is set to 0.24. Now if you wind up the amount to plus 12, you'll note that there's not a lot happening. So we need to go to the AMS mixer and see what's happening. So you press the menu key and you go to It's PAMS Mixer 2, and what you'll see is that there's a smoothing option, but it's for aftertouch. Now, since the Kross will only receive aftertouch and doesn't send aftertouch, this is going to have no effect on the setting. However, as you can see, I've got the vortex. This is going to send aftertouch messages, so that's at the extreme setting of +12. As you can see, that AMS2 mixer is applying smoothing to that sound, but it's only going to affect the aftertouch, and it's very subtle. So wind it back to 0.24 and you'll get a far more subtle aftertouch effect if you're using something like this. You will also notice that the AMS setting at the top of the page is set to SW1 or switch 1, and the amount is set to 0. If you hold down switch 1 and press notes, you'll get palm muting. This is an effect where the guitarist uses the palm of his picking hand to dampen the strings. This will produce a staccato effect. Here's some regular picking. Now with palm muting, I've got my hand resting against the strings, so you can hear it cutting the note very, very short. For the ultimate example of this, go to any Al Di Meola album and he'll turn that into an art form with really rapid staccato notes that are muted in this fashion. We'll look at how this palm muting effect is produced shortly, but try setting the amount to +12 and play a note while bending the mod wheel with switch 1 pressed down. Now the LFO is trying to kick in and you get that very slight weird honk and bend at the front of the note. Now palm muting and vibrato are something that a guitarist wouldn't typically do together, since the idea of the palm mute is to actually stop the string ringing. So the amount is set to 0 here, and set the amount back to 0 and press the menu button to reinstate that setting. Let's see how switch 1 is being used to create the palm muting. If you press the menu button and go to the T-Mod tab in the P-Amp EG page, this is where it all kicks off. The amp levels, which will cut the volume of the sound short very quickly, are controlled by these 3 AMS settings. AMS 1 is set to note number, and what this means is that muting effects are going to apply in slightly different fashions from the further you move to the right and the further you move to the left of middle C. It's very, very subtle and you can barely hear it because of what's happening around it. Using the down arrow, scroll down to AMS 2 and you'll see that the amount of muting is dependent on the velocity of the note you play. Now this is neat because how hard you press on the strings of a real guitar when palm muting will determine how quickly the sound cuts out. If you scroll down, you'll get to the AMS 3 setting, which is switch 1. This is the important one, and it's got a very fast attack time and a release time set to 0. Now if you set the decay time, which is in the negative, to +99, you'll notice that the switch has absolutely no effect and the thing's starting to sustain. So you can see that this setting is having a massive effect on the palm muting. Place that setting back at -63, where I think it was originally, and press the menu button and select the P filter page. In the mod tab, you'll see the AMS 2 setting is set to switch 1 with a setting of -2. Now I've just wound that amount up to +99, and with the switch 1 pressed down, I'm going to start rolling that back. And that's back at its original -2 setting, and you can see that what's happening is that the filter is cutting in, and what it's doing is actually gating out certain parts of the sound to help mute it. With the setting back at -2, the note that you play is going to sound a lot more muffled. Now if you tab back across to the basic tab, you'll see the reason for this. There are two filters in place. The output of one is running into the other. Now I've set the frequency of the low pass filter to 99 and I'm gradually rolling it back. And it's having no effect because the switch isn't switched on, therefore there's no AMS control telling the filter to cut in. So let's push it back up at 99, and this time with the switch down, let's start rolling it back. To the setting of 24 where it was. And you can hear that AMS switches the control on, the filter on, and it's cutting in. Now the high pass filter at the bottom end, if we set that to 99, you can see what that's doing to the sound. So I'm going to bring that back down again and put that back at its original setting, and you can see that what those two filters are doing is chiseling away at the sound to give you that muted sound, and to also chip away at some of the top end that will give you a completely different effect. Now I've set that to high pass filter back at 22, and what palm muting with a real guitar will do is not only affect the volume, it'll change the tone and filter out the highs in the same fashion. So you can see that the switch is being used as an AMS source to mute the sound's volume and to filter out the top end, and that's how we'll imitate the playing of a real guitar player. That's oscillator 1. Now let's reintroduce oscillator 2 and see what it's adding and how it's doing it. Rather than resetting everything in the PBasic page, press the exit button and quickly select another patch and roll back to the screaming tube guitar, and you should have everything reset. Now press the menu button and select the POSC page. Now the sound of oscillator 1 is made up of two samples. These are 183, the E guitar overdrive setting, which cuts in when the velocity hits 20, and the E185 E guitar dist mute setting, which works at velocities below 20. This adds a sense of realism to the sound because real strings sound different depending on how violently they're hit. However, the second oscillator is the one we're interested in now, so change the OS1 setting to OS2. Now the OS2 has only one sample, and it's 282, the triangle MG setting. Change the OSC2 setting back to OSC1 and switch off both the guitar samples by highlighting the boxes to the left of the word mono and using the dial. Tab over to the second one and do the same thing. And what you should be hearing now is just the feedback tone, which is basically oscillator 2 working on its own. What you're hearing is just the triangle MG sound. The MG is short for modulation generator, and a triangle modulation generator is a bit of electrical kit that will give you a triangle wave like this. While playing the key, push the mod wheel and you'll hear the feedback effect and the volume will increase. Maybe now you can figure out what's happening here. The signal can barely be heard against the oscillator 1 when they're both running, but as the mod wheel starts and shifts, the volume of the second oscillator increases and the guitar sound now has added feedback as well as vibrato. Listen carefully and you'll also hear that the feedback has vibrato applied to it in exactly the same fashion as the first oscillator. Leave the sounds in oscillator 1 both switched off and change the OSC1 setting to OSC2. Note that the tone has been transposed upwards by 7 semitones. Play a note with the transpose set to 0 and push the mod wheel. Now do the same thing with the transpose. Up 7. Now you won't hear a lot happening there. I've switched the other oscillator back on now, and what's going to happen is that the overtones that are generated as the two oscillators start working together will create a different type of feedback. That slight detuning provides a sound that's really characteristic of a guitar feeding back, so it's a neat touch. I've switched the first oscillator off again, and now I'm going to look at what other settings are in play and how in particular the volume of the feedback sound is being controlled by the mod wheel. Press the menu button and select the P pitch page. In the mod tab, you'll note that the mod wheel intensity setting for the LFO 1 is 0.4, with the AMS setting set to AMS mixer 2. The amount is 0.24. This setting should seem familiar. It's exactly the same as in oscillator 1, and it sets the feedback to provide and follow the gentle vibrato that was applied to the first oscillator. It also sets the aftertouch to work in the same fashion. If you go to the P-OSC LFO page, you'll see that the LFO settings are exactly the same, with the feedback tone designed to follow the guitar waveform, with the frequency set to 64. In the AMS2 mixer for this oscillator, the same smoothing controls are also applied. Press the menu button and select the P-Pitch EG page. In the L-Mod page, you'll see that the AMS1 setting is set to switch 1, with the attack time set to -31. Play a note and hit switch 1. The switch gates the sound and stops it dead. Now the physics of the electric guitar are such that you won't get feedback when palm muting. This setting makes sure that you don't get it on the Kross either. Now this is only part of the equation, because this is stopping the pitch envelope from changing the pitch and producing vibrato. The P-amp and the P-amp EG settings will be the key in killing the volume of the feedback signal when the switch is engaged to provide muting. Select the P-amp page and make sure that you're on the setting for oscillator 2. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that the velocity intensity setting is set to +40. Now, if you hit a key, the sound will react to how fast you press it. If you set the amount to -99, you'll get absolute silence. That's back at 27, 28, and that's back at +40. This control is affecting the volume of the feedback and making it dependent on the force that you play the notes. This will make the feedback level more random and more natural as it follows the force of your playing. Now if you look at the bottom of this page, you'll see that LFO2's AMS setting is set to switch 1 and the amount is -99. Set this to +99 and press a key. The note doesn't mute. Hear the switch cutting in, but the note isn't muting. Logically, this doesn't make sense, because all that should be happening is whatever LFO2 is running, this switch shouldn't affect the output. It should just stop the LFO from oscillating. So let's go to LFO2 and see what's happening there. Press the menu button and select the P-LFO OSC page. In the 2FRQ page, you'll note that the setting is greyed out and the stop setting is highlighted for the frequency setting of the second oscillator. Now the parameter guide suggests that when the stop setting applies, instead of the LFO operating normally, it will ignore the frequency setting. The LFO will maintain the initial value as determined by the combination of waveform, phase, shape and offset that are set in the tab next to it, the WAV2 tab. Since all of these are set to 0, my assumption is this setting won't produce anything, and sure enough the switch, when it tries to bring in this LFO, produces silence. The only thing remaining is to figure out how the volume of the feedback sound appears to get louder when the mod wheel opens. This one nearly foxed me because it's really clever, but fear not, this is how it's done. If you press the menu button and select the P filter page, in the basic tab you'll see that there is a low pass filter in place and that the frequency is set to 40. Push the mod wheel up full and press a key. Now roll the setting back to 0. And you can hear that low pass filter cutting in. The filter is cutting in to remove high frequency content from the sound. Since the sound has absolutely no low end, a 0 setting filters out everything. Reset that frequency control to 40 and clearly we can see that the mod wheel is controlling the opening and closing of the filter. If you now tab over to the mod setting, the problem is that the frequency appears to be being controlled by the pitch wheel and the AMS mixer too. No mention of the mod wheel. Now the pitch bend setting is set to 0, so that's got no effect. If we press the menu button and choose the PAMS setting and look at AMS2, there's no mention of the mod wheel controlling anything. However, the smoothing setting is being controlled by AMS1, and if we tab back to AMS1, sure enough, AMS properties shows the mod wheel with an amount of plus 99. Roll the setting back to 0, push the mod wheel, it will have absolutely no effect. So you can see where that mod wheel effect is working. Push that back to 99. Now this is complicated, but basically the mod wheel is mixed with the switch to create AMS1. This output is being smoothed by AMS2 and the filter is opening and closing thanks to the output of AMS2. Now these settings are actually a little bit convoluted, but the mod wheel and the switch both need to be smooth and both need to affect the filter. This is why it's been set up in this way. Without the mute effect applied by switch 1, it would have been much easier to set up, but obviously less versatile. That, in the simplest terms possible, is how you add feedback to a guitar sound. Of course, if you change the samples used in oscillator 1, you can have a sound with feedback that is a synth, piano or organ, etc, etc. I could stop here with the basic distorted guitar program, but I'm going to make it better by adding more AMS controls. Now the feedback settings that you've got with this particular sound will work perfectly well with any synth sound, but don't forget that if you change the sample to a synth sound rather than a guitar sound on oscillator 1, that you've also got within the master and the insert effects guitar effects processed in there. So basically you've got amp simulations, cabinet simulations and possibly some distortion floating around in there. So what you need to do is to change those as well to give you a cleaner synth sound, unless you want distortion and guitar simulation on your synth sounds as well.